Hudnall Show, coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas, gateway to the Old West, the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is June the 6th, 157th day of the year. 208 days remain to the year's over with. June 6th is primarily known as D-Day. The Allied forces landed in Normandy, France during World War II. It's also the anniversary of the Young Men's Christian Association, which was founded in 1844. Other notable events on June 6th include the premiere of Sex and the City in 1998, also the founding of the Chrysler Corporation in 1925, and the signing of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. Holidays and observances. I don't know what's got me coughing so bad today. All right. Holidays and observances. It's National Donut Day. National Drive-In Movie Day. National Fish and Chips Day. World Green Roof Day. Russian Language Day. And my system has froze. There we go. Queensland Day, National Yo-Yo Day, National Gardening Exercise Day, Infant Feeding Day, National Applesauce Cake Day, National Caves and Karst Day. Get out there today and explore a local cave or a karst, and who knows what you'll find. World Pest Day, National Eyewear Day, National Higher Education Day, Statehood Day in Sweden, Couscous Festival, National Fishing and Boating Week, the Rose Festival, Miracle the Beautiful Week, Medicare Fraud Prevention Week, and Wine Days Festival in Armenia. Everybody needs to run out to Armenia and get plastered. All right, let's see what's in the news today. President Trump's aides going to try to talk to Elon Musk today. There's tension between he and the president. Musk takes good advice, does an about-face after the SpaceX announcement amid the Trump feud. Musk said SpaceX will start decommissioning the Dragon, which is the Dragon spacecraft. Then, after saying that, he did a reverse a few hours later. New Biden book by what was her name? Karine Jean-Pierre. There's a new Biden book that reveals how the White House staff felt about her as press secretary. There's apparently a good bit of resentment. Let's see. During their book tour in Chicago, Original Sin authors Alex Thompson and Jake Tapper asked about the announcement of Jean-Pierre's new book, which was going to shed light on the broken White House she worked in, and she left the Democratic Party to become an independent. And Thompson responded, it's like the ballet move to say that you're leaving the Democratic Party because of disloyal to Joe Biden, but that's what she's saying. He was not the king. Everybody seems to overlook that. There's a dangerous devil in the Ozarks. That's the former police chief is on the run. Outdoorsmen have been wanting to stay away from the Ozarks until he's captured. A number of survivalists live in that area, and they put out a warning for hikers and outdoorsmen to steer clear. The group has called out Tim Cook, the head of Apple, for Apple TV's Eucharistic desecration. Apple TV show your friends and neighbors aired a controversial church scene, which has the Catholics very upset. They demanded an apology and removal of the Eucharistic desecration scene in the show. Democrats are trying to construct a Frankenstein candidate for 2028, while J.D. Vance gains momentum. They think he'll probably be the Republican nominee unless he screws up big time between now and then. Carnival has accused Jewish donors of abandoning Democrats because they want their taxes cut. Could be because the Democrats have abandoned them. Well, a woman's deadly brain infection is linked to a common household practice. She dies of a brain-eating amoeba after using tap water in a nasal rinse device. Patients succumb to a rare Naegleria fowli infection despite treatment. Here we have arsenic in our water. So I wouldn't use tap water for any type of nasal rinse device here. Let's see. Restaurant chains accused of shrinkflation. Leaves your customers feeling deceived. The Cheesecake Factory, famous for its large portion sizes, is 200 plus locations across the U.S. Chain is well known for having an expensive, calorie-packed menu of over 250 items in various cuisines. I'm second to none in saying that the cheesecake outlet we have here is outstanding, but that's not exactly the Cheesecake Factory. And their portions are respectable. Diddy's going back to court as an ex-girlfriend is prepared to take the stand. She's alleging abuse. Job growth has continued to slow in May with economic uncertainty. Secretary Hexas commemorates D-Day and Normandy. Congress considers a controversial AI provision that would strip states of the power for a decade. Greg Gutfield said Korean GPS fans are sharpening their crayons. He apparently doesn't have a high opinion of her and her followers. There's a new House bill that will strengthen the relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. Being introduced here on D-Day. With legal crossings down 95%, resources are stretched somewhat thin at the border. Former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel is telling Democrat elites to shut up and sit down. That time somebody told him. Former Army captain is launching an effort to de-woke the DOD under Trump's orders. The group has launched a tip line for DOD employees to report DEI and woke overreach. His name is Doug Trowell, former U.S. Army captain, 1992 West Point graduate. Well, there's been 7 times one of God's anointed has ruled against the Trump administration this week. You seem to feel that being appointed a judge makes them smarter than anybody else. Well, there's a dwindling group of World War II vets who have returned to Normandy to mark D-Day. And the group is dwindling primarily because they're dying off. That Saharan dust plume is still heading toward the U.S. Father's Day is coming up. You need to rush out and get your Father's Day gifts. Turns out Biden only hand-signed one pardon during his pardon spree, and that was the one for Hunter Biden, the one he said he wouldn't do. But then he went and did it. USA just closed the Panama Canal. I spent 3 years running back and forth across the canal. Biden's doctor subpoenaed amid a bombshell cognitive decline cover-up allegation. Apparently everybody was willing to risk their careers to protect him. Charlemagne the God said Jean-Pierre hid the conspiracy until it was too late. German Chancellor saying Trump's tariffs are threatening his economy. Staged car crashes are putting us all at risk. Congress and the Justice Department are moving to stop it. Criminal networks orchestrate fake collisions nationwide. It drains $308 billion annually. Well, Jimmy Buffett's $275 million estate has become the center of a heated inheritance dispute. Jane Buffett and co-trustee Richard Mosenter both filed legal petitions over the so-called marital trust. His widow has filed a petition to have the co-trustee removed for failing to act in her best interest, which with the marital trust was actually created for her benefit. Jane Buffett married the singer in 1977, and she is alleging the co-trustee's been openly hostile and adversarial, worked against her, failed to perform the most basic task required of him in his role as co-trustee. He won't even tell her any information about what's in the trust. Well, Disney series showrunner Tony Gilroy pushes back against the political labeling of his Star Wars show. It's being accused of being a left-wing political story. And I would say there's a lot to that if you look at how anti-Trump Mark Hamill has become. Goodyear marks the 100th anniversary of the Goodyear blimp with special flights. U.S. attorneys launched an operation to hold sanctuary cities accountable. They think because they're sanctuary cities, the law doesn't apply to them. One of God's anointed has tossed the lawsuit that alleges University of Pennsylvania campus is hostile for Jewish students, in spite of evidence to the contrary. Trump appointee leads dramatic gang crackdown as migrants free from U.S. Marshals. The at-home chain prepares to file for bankruptcy. And China's trying to dominate the world of AI, according to a Republican lawmaker. Well, let's see what else we got. Okay. Well, we've been talking about a lot of off-the-wall topics. We got a new one, and this is in response to a question I had from a listener. Who are the little people? In May of 1958, a group of workmen found out that you shouldn't try to cross the ferries, not even in the 20th century. Trouble began when the workmen began digging a hole for an electric power pole on a small mound outside of Wexford, Ireland. Villagers warned the workmen that that mound was a wrath of the little people. Now, for those who are not familiar, a wrath is a dwelling place of the so-called wee folk. Now, when the townspeople told the workmen, told to never stay put, electricians were quick to scoff at such childish superstitions. The very idea suggesting that the ferries would dislodge a pole they had expertly sunk into the ground was just absolutely unbelievable. According to the supervisor, the ferries would have a hard time of it if they chose to try to loose a pole that worked from the state electricity board had set in place. Next morning, that huge pole tilted awkwardly. Now, the foreman, of course, blamed the villagers and called them flaming idiots. They think they can have a bit of fun with their flaming fairy stories. He was absolutely positive some of the fun-loving clods had come out there during the night and wiggled the pole loose. So it was reset with an extra bit of tamping, a little concrete thrown in for good. Next morning, the pole was again resting loosely in the churned up earth. Now, other poles in the line stood straight and firm, but the pole that had been put in the ferryway tilted to the side. Well, the foreman decided he had enough of the villagers' games. He ordered the hole to be dug 6 feet wide. Once it's been accomplished, he put the pole precisely in the middle and packed the earth so firmly around its base that he thought nothing short of an atomic bomb would loosen it. Come to dawn, that pole had been pushed free of the raft. Well, ignoring the grins of the villagers, the workmen dug a second hole 4 feet outside the ferry mount. Undisturbed by the little people or even prankster villagers, that pole stands today as solidly as it did when it was put in. 1962, some enterprising gentlemen in a small village in Iceland decided to enlarge a grain processing plant. One Icelandic tradition, no landowner must fail to observe a small plot on his property for the mysterious hidden folk. And a few of the rural people pointed out to the gentleman that any extension of the plant would encroach on that plot of ground that had been set aside for the rural people. Well, the businessmen laughed. They were much smarter than the local yokels. They possessed modern, unbreakable drills and plenty of dynamite to supplement the tirelessly gnawing teeth of the drill bits. And they had a crew of highly qualified men to operate the equipment. So their progress would be held up by any such ridiculous superstition. But once they started work, the bits of the unbreakable drills began to shatter one after the other. One old farmer came forward to repeat the warning that they were trespassing on land that belonged to the hidden folk. Well, the workmen, being much smarter than the farmer, of course, secure in their education and life, laughed at the old man and expressed their shock that such a doddering, superstitious old fool would still exist in modern Jet Age Iceland. But no matter what they said or did, the drill bits kept breaking. Finally, the manager of the plant, though professing disbelief in such prattle, agreed to the old farmer's suggestion. He consulted a local seer to establish contact with the hidden folk to try to make peace with them. Well, the seer was called and went into a trance and told the manager there was one particularly powerful entity who had selected this plot as his dwelling place. He did add, however, that the hidden one was not unreasonable. After the seer had explained that the businessman really needed the extra room for expansion, the entity agreed to find another place to live. He only asked for some time to make his arrangements. He asked the manager to stop the dwelling for 5 days, and that would give him enough time to find another plot of land. The manager felt a little weird of bargaining on something he couldn't see, but he looked at the pile of broken drill bits and told the seer the hidden one had a deal. After 5 days, the workmen resumed their dwelling. From then on, the work went efficiently, and not a single additional drill bit was broken on that unbreakable drill. Admittedly, these tales sound as if they came from a time much earlier in our own, but there were strange powers the little people exerted over their human neighbors in centuries past seem to be just as potent today. What are the fairies of legend and folklore and apparently fact? They live in the surviving remnants of a past civilization and a species of man of diminutive stature. We folks may have been quite advanced, and they possessed a technology that seemed magical to the migrating barbarians who later became the established people of the area. We people may have died out. They may have been assimilated into the encroaching culture by intermarriage, or may actually have just gone underground. In most traditions, especially in the British Isles and Scandinavia, the fairy folk were supernormal entities who inhabited magical kingdoms beneath the surface of the world. Fairies have always been considered to be akin to men, and always been known to be something more than mortal man. They've been popularly conceived of as belonging solely to the realm of spirit. And a lot of the ancient texts declare the fairies are of a middle nature between man and angel. And one factor has been consistent in fairy lore. The middle folk continually meddle in the affairs of man, sometimes for good, sometimes for evil. Well, some biblically oriented authorities have sought to cast the fairies in the role of the rebellious angels who were driven out of heaven during the celestial uprising instigated by Lucifer. These dispossessed angels, or demons, depending on your point of view, took up new abodes on earth, materialized in human bodies, and took humans and mates, breeding, of course, a hybrid race of entities that was between man and angel. In the December 1920 issue of Strand magazine in London, there were published some allegedly authentic photographs of real fairies. Pictures are said to have been taken near the village of Cottingley by two young girls, Elsie Wright and her cousin Frances Griffith, who had basically a cheap camera. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle managed to obtain the negatives and probably one of England's most eminent photographic analysts. At first, the man laughed at the whole idea of fairy photographs, but amazingly, he ended up making a public statement. He was quite willing to risk his professional reputation that the photographs were single exposures, and all the figures of the fairies had actually moved during exposure, which was instantaneous. He also declared he could find not even the slightest evidence of fakery in the pictures. Well, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle insisted on obtaining the opinion of another photographic expert, took the negatives to the Kodak Company's office in Kingsway. And these experts declined to go on record that the girls had photographed actual fairies, but they did issue a statement. They couldn't find any evidence of trick photography or of anyone having tampered with the film. They also emphasized they couldn't find no flaws of any kind in the negatives. Well, another analyst observed that while such effects might be duplicated by some exceedingly clever studio painting, the most significant factor in the Cottingley photographs was that the fairy figures had actually been caught in motion. Now, the photographs had been taken in a little valley through which ran a narrow stream. Elsie Wright first made the acquaintance of the fairies and she introduced them at once to her cousin. One snapshot taken by Elsie in December 1917 when she was 16 captures her 10-year-old cousin seated on the grass surrounded by a group of 4 dancing fairies. Another, taken a few months later, shows Elsie with a tiny gnome. According to a reporter for the Westminster Gazette, who journeyed to Cottingley to investigate the circumstances surrounding the photographs for his paper. None of the people had seen the fairies, though everybody in the little village knew that they existed. Ms. Wright, without hesitation, narrated the whole of the circumstances without adding any comment. She said the girls would spend the whole day in the narrow valley, even taking their lunch with them, though they were within a stone's throw of their homes. The story Ms. Wright related was that Elsie's father had acquired a camera and one Saturday afternoon allowed his girl to take a picture. He only one plate in position and explained to her how to take a snapshot. Well, Elsie and Frances came back several minutes later and asked Mr. Wright if he had developed a plate. According to the reporter, when that was done, Elsie noticed the fairies were beginning to show and exclaimed in an exciting tone, "Oh, Frances, the fairies are on the plate." And the second photograph was equally successful. Now, when the journalist pressed Wright for his version of how the photograph had come to be taken, he detailed the same story as his wife. Elsie was quite uncommunicative about the matter, but at last he yielded to the newsman's persistence and agreed to answer his questions. He asked where the fairies came from, said she didn't know. Had she seen them arrive? She said yeah, but she still hadn't seen from where they came. Had she seen them before the time she took the famous photographs? Yes, she and Frances had seen them since they were very small children. And he asked had they told anyone of their meeting fairies, and she said yes, and the plates are in the possession of Mr. Gardner, president of the Theosophical Society. And then he asked had anybody else in the village seen the fairies, and apparently not. But they all took the girl's word for their experiences with them and believed in the reality of the photographs. On occasion, the fairies had gone away when other mortals had approached them. And she was convinced that only she and Frances had been granted the gift of seeing the Cottingley little people. Well, the journalist presented his interview in an unbiased manner. He seemed either unwilling or unable to expose the stories of fraud, and neither he nor subsequent on-the-scene investigators able to uncover the slightest shred of proof that Elsie and Frances had deliberately set out to perpetuate a hoax. Well, as the press spread the story of the Cottingley photographs around the world, numerous reputable individuals came forward to testify that they had also played with little people as children. More elaborate and more expensive cameras were sent to the girls in the hope that they could snap some additional photographs. And according to Elsie and Francis and others, images of fairies did indeed show up on the plates of the more sophisticated cameras. Well, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle enlisted the services of one of England's most gifted clairvoyants to see if he might physically or psychically verify the girls' accounts of fairies in the Little Valley. He sat down with the girls and found that he was able to see even more than they did because of his mediumistic abilities. According to his sensitive visions, the entire glen was alive with a lot of divergent forms of elemental life. He saw wood elves and gnomes and fairies and goblins and even undines floating over the stream. Clairvoyant lacked the ability to feed the fairies and have psychic energy to allow them to materialize, though. It appeared that Elsie and Francis were the only people who had this strange ability. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle issued a summation of his interpretation and investigation of phenomena, which he stated, "I do not myself contend that the proof is as overwhelming as in the case of spiritualistic phenomena, but that may also come, and for present, while more evidence will be welcome, there's enough already convincing evidence available. For centuries, various individuals have felt that they had come up with convincing evidence that the little people exist. What do you call them? Fairies or brownies or banshees or red ones or good folk or leprechauns, or personify them as Puck, Robin Goodfellow, or Bob. Persistent tales and an enormous library of folklore has been built around the stories of the little folk. Fairies are said to enchant humans and take advantage of them. It's related they can marry humans or cast a spell on a likely lad or lass and have their way with them against the mortal's will, and they seem to delight in kidnapping children and adults and whisking them off to the underground fairy kingdoms. But on the other side of the coin, the story is told that fairies can materialize to help a farmer harvest his crop or help a housemaid clean up her kitchen. They guide humans with their ability to divine the future, and they stand by to assist at the birth of a favored child, tutor and protect him for the rest of his life. It's interesting to consider that the same thing said to be true of little people might also be said to be of the reported instances in which occupants of UFOs involve themselves with Homo sapiens. UFO knots have been reported to hypnotize or enchant men and women in order to make the earthlings more malleable. There have been instances reported in which they allegedly had sexual intercourse with earthlings, in which what would appear to be the attempt to create a hybrid. Numerous documented cases in which it seems that men, women, and children have been kidnapped and taken on board UFOs. And the UFO knots have been reported working closely with certain representatives of Homo sapiens throughout the years, aiding and advising them, and maybe in a less sophisticated time, they even help them get in the crops. Maybe the most widely known bit of fairy lore is the scene in which a farmer comes upon one or more of the wee folks digging in the earth. And the farmer, of course, naturally supposes the little one is bearing his goal, so he snatches the fairy by the leg and forces him to tell him about his treasure. And this done, the farmer frees the spirit and marks the spot so he'll be able to find it again. By the time he comes back with his implements, the spot's been altered or confused in some manner to make the excavation of the gold an impossible task. Well, this tale has been told with endless modifications and variations, but it remains essentially a story of a fairy outwitting an avaricious man. It's widely known that there are many stories in which a man discovers the fairy at their work and is whisked away by them to the fairy kingdom, from which he may return much later as an old man who thinks only a day's gone by, or which he may never return. Maybe the fairies aren't digging for gold at all. Maybe the little people are UFO knots taking soil, mineral, and lagoon samples and there's no activities known. There's another account that they've been told is a fairy tale if it had happened 400 years ago. August 17th, 1962, Avelino de Silva, a miner from Diamantina, Brazil, came upon two strange little people, about 3 feet tall, digging a hole. Startled, the tiny man ran into the bushes at de Silva's approach. And he stood there rooted to the spot. a hat-shaped object ascended into the sky. De Silva clearly found it difficult to assess the bizarre scene that had just played out for him. He went home that night, thought about it, probably tried to integrate the whole weird business into his experience. Next day, when he told his friends at the mine what he had seen, they laughed at him, of course. But shortly after dawn on August 20th, his 12-year-old son, Raimundo, was awakened by strange voices. Somewhere later, he heard him say, "Larvalino was in here. He has to be destroyed." Raimundo saw a shadow of something not quite like a human being and only half as large. He saw it float rather than walk through his bedroom. And then his father began to move as if he was entranced. He opened the front door and walked toward two large globes that were hovering about 6 feet off the ground. Those strange objects made a humming sound and blinked with a strange kind of light. Raimundo screamed at his father to come back, but the man continued to walk toward the mysterious floating objects. And before he could make a move to grab his father by the hand and shake him out of his trance, the globes emitted a heavy, yellowish smoke that completely enveloped his father's form. When the smoke cleared, the floating balls and Ravelino de Silva had vanished. Raimundo and his two young brothers, Fatimo and Tercio, ran to the police station and told the tale of his father's disappearance. Police began an immediate investigation. If it was here in El Paso, they'd say, well, so what? At the De Silva home, they found a strange, cleanly swept area in the dust about 16 feet in diameter. Couldn't find any sign of any footprint or track in the area. They did find a few drops of blood about 160 feet from the house. But even on laboratory analysis established the fact that blood was human blood, there was no way to determine whether or not it came from De Silva. Well, the police tried their best to break Raimundo's story and began to operate on the premise the boy had murdered his father and somehow hit upon the ingenious method of disposing of the corpse. At last, they were convinced that the terrified 12-year-old sincerely mourned his lost father and was psychologically incapable of a murder. Then a fisherman came up with a story that he had seen peculiar globes circling the De Silva home on the evening of August 19th. De Silva's mounted friends reported his encounter with the little men, and the case was officially closed as unsolved. Well, if you put this story in a different time and a different cultural context, you got a fairy tale of a workman who came upon two little people bearing their gold. After failing to trick them into giving up their treasure, the man is taken off to the fairy kingdom in a mysterious golden coach, never to be seen again. Well, even the description given by men and women who observed UFO knots matches those given of the fairy folk. Now, we're not referring to the tiny 6-inch tall creatures with gossamer wings, but to the more common folklore fairy who stands about 3 feet, between 3 and 5 feet tall, has large eyes, a pointed chin, and sharp features. Almost uncommon in fairy folklore is confrontations with the little people bearing their gold, or the tales of fairy lovers who seem actively to lust after mortals. Such accounts are beginning to crop up more and more in the annals of ufology. One of the most classic tales involves Antonio Villas-Boas. This was October 15, 1957. He was a young farmer who lived near the town of Francisco de Sales in the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais. He claimed to have been drug on board a UFO. He said the craft was shaped like a large elongated egg with 3 metal spurs in front. His kidnappers were about his height, about 5'4". And once they got him into the craft, they stripped him naked and poked and prodded him with needles and unidentifiable implements. And then came the real surprise. He was put in a room with a totally naked woman of the alien species. He described her as having large blue eyes that seemed to slant outward, a straight nose, high cheekbones, a nearly lipless mouth, and a sharply pointed chin. According to all reports, she was what you might refer to as hot stuff, because Antonio later became down with symptoms of radiation poisoning. So was the female a modern counterpart of the fairy lover? take this account, which was thoroughly investigated by doctors in an earlier time, what will we have? A young farmer working in the field is drug off inside a fairy mound filled with lustrous shining lights where the fairy queen who'd been enamored with him makes him her husband. Then after the honeymoon, when he commits some cloddish human act considered taboo by the fairies, he's once again returned to his farm and finds himself behind his oxen, in which case Antonio Villas-Boas was on a tractor. Could the romantic tales of dancing fairies and tiny royalty be ancient accounts of UFO knots as interpreted by the storytellers of long ago in the jargon of their own time? Could the fairies be elemental entities who always existed and functioned on Earth, coexisting with Homo sapiens and mingling with them in thousands of subtle ways? Is the fairyland another way of simply referring to the spirit world? There may actually be a solid kernel of reality at the core of centuries of myth and legend. You know, there have been a lot of stories of giants in the earth whose hidden homes are in Minnesota. We've talked about sea phantoms, the ghostly denizens of the deep. We've even talked about talking animals and humans who converse with them. And we've got fascinating mysteries of islands that come and go. And we talked about first-hand accounts of people who actually visit the past and folks who've actually vanished in front of astounded witnesses. And we've got flying matter and falling flesh that comes from the sky. We've talked about glowing ghosts and very spook lights and flames that flare up in the night. And let's not forget the fire people, the victims of spontaneous human combustion. Much as we like to believe our science knows everything, clearly we do not. Now, at this point, since this is D-Day, let's talk about some ghosts of D-Day. Now, the ghost of D-Day, on the one hand, refers to the Ghost Army. That was a secret U.S. Army unit that played a crucial role in deceiving the Germans during the D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944. The Ghost Army's mission was to create a fake army using deception and camouflage to mislead the Nazis about the location and size of the Allied forces. They used fake radio traffic, decoy equipment. Some of it was actually inflatable. And the Germans were caught, for the most part, flat-footed. But there were other, shall we say, more bizarre stories from World War II. You know, during the war, Switzerland did its best to remain neutral. Both the Allies and the Axis tried to get it on their side. When Germany initiated acts of aggression against Switzerland, the UK sent reinforcements. That was how one British company found himself stationed in a remote village in the Swiss Alps. A few weeks after that British company entered the village, the locals started to notice a series of strange incidents. Pieces of wood and tarps disappeared from sheds. Valuables were stolen from their homes. The culmination of these events was a child from the village going missing. First, it was assumed that the disappearance was a tragic accident, but then more children started to disappear. The only adult to disappear was Private Reginald from the British unit. He went missing from the barracks, and this led to a rumor that a monster was living in the mountains and preying on the village. And after the private disappeared, more children disappeared. One night, a figure was seen peering through the window of a house as the soldiers patrolled the town. The soldiers yelled at the figure, which took off running, and they gave chase. They reached the edge of the village where the figure appeared to jump into the ground. When the soldiers searched, they found a cave hollowed out of the side of a snowdrift. Well, shots were fired from the cave and returned by the soldiers, and after moments of silence, they investigated the cave. And inside, they found Reginald shot through the heart, surrounded by half-eaten bodies of 7 children. Since Reginald didn't have any weapons, who shot him is still a mystery to this day. Now, cannibalism during the war has happened throughout history. In most cases, it occurred due to dwindling supplies and need for survival. Well, for Indian prisoners of war held by the Japanese forces in New Guinea and Singapore, it was a culmination of their torture. According to testimonies from POWs for the War Crimes Investigation Commission, cannibalism was conducted under supervision. 2 testimonies state that 19 prisoners were eaten by their Japanese captives. The reason wasn't survival, but the simple fact that they could. Testimonies state that certain parts were removed from the body and cooked, including the thighs and the liver and the buttocks. There were times when the prisoners were dead when this happened, other times they were still living. Now, from cannibals, let's talk about something that's still going on today. Ghost planes. You know, a lot of folks saw ghost planes during and after the war. Fighter aircraft would appear and disappear without a trace. One such sighting occurred a year after the attack on Pearl Harbor. When the U.S. Army radar started to pick up the signal of an incoming plane, a few pilots were sent out to investigate. They came back with a strange story. They actually found the plane, and it was an American P-40. It looked like it had been through a battle. The plane was said to be covered in bullet holes with the landing gear missing and the pilot bloody. Pilots had seen that plane suddenly crash as if it dropped out of the sky. They went to investigate the crash site, only to find the plane minus its pilot. Nobody ever determined what happened to the pilot. And then, of course, not only do we have ghost planes, we got a mystery blimp. It was the L-8. You know, it's an L-8 blimp. That's the type of blimp it was. It took off from Treasure Island in 1942. It was on a submarine spotting mission and crewed by 2 men, an ensign and a lieutenant. And it was a very simple mission. But an hour and a half into the patrol, the pilot radioed they were investigating a possible oil slick in the water. That was the last transmission that came from the L-8. Later that day, it was seen drifting over the coast and starting to sag in the middle. There were a couple of cables dangling down, and some folks on the ground grabbed the cables and tried to bring the craft down. They couldn't. The flight of the L-8 ended when it crashed into a house in Daly City. This is in California, don't you know? Rescue team sent to the crash site found something strange. The doors to the cabin were open and the crew was missing. Where everything was in its place and no emergency gear had been used, the 2 crewmen simply vanished, were never found. Then in the Philippines, we've got what's known as the Diplomat Hotel, prime spot for ghost hunters. There's banging and screaming being heard in the middle of the night. Terror scene in this building occurred when the Japanese invaded the Philippines. The building had once been a monastery. The invading forces beheaded all the nuns and clergy when they took the city. The monastery was turned into a sanatorium for the remainder of the war. After the war, the use of the building changed again as it became a hotel. And guests at the hotel often reported seeing black figures and women in white. There are many, many stories that I've read about the Diplomat Hotel. Now let's turn to Normandy. It's got a number of sites from World War II that can be visited today. One father decided to do this with his 7-year-old daughter. Now, while in France, nothing odd occurred that the father saw, but But in the year after the visit, the daughter often talked about the men and other things she saw while they were there. She described men pointing guns at her and following her when they toured the bunkers in the area. She described them as hiding behind corners and moving around like soldiers would. And while this could normally be written off as an active imagination of a child, she was able to perfectly describe the uniforms of both sides of the conflict. The father himself didn't see anything. Then we have the SS Alkimos, American ship, where strange accidents happened. It is built for use in the war and was sold to Norway, which used it to transport weapons. In 1944, the radio operator was killed by one of the crew who then shot himself. Death was covered up. The radio operator was claimed to have been killed by enemy fire. After the war, the ship was sold to a Greek shipping company. In 1963, the ship crashed into a reef and caught fire while in Fremantle for repairs. The ship barely left Fremantle for Hong Kong for more repairs when the tow line snapped. Well, it couldn't be unstuck from its location. It ran aground. Many companies tried to salvage it over the years. Each attempt was met with bad things happening to the crew. The caretaker had been left on board, also reported hearing footsteps and voices and having very strange feelings. The ship was eventually abandoned and slowly sank into the water. Then we have the ghost of Islington. During the darkest days of the war, Rosetta French was a volunteer line watcher in the London borough of Islington. And while she couldn't serve on the front line, she could check for traveling fires and bomb threats. During one of her shifts, she encountered a supernatural force. While standing at her post, she noticed a shining white figure. She assumed it was a person or maybe a gravestone, but the figure was too tall for that. When she later told other people about the being, it appeared that, as if she'd called it, her post was next to a church and cemetery. She believed the figure was lost souls escaping from the grave. There are many stories of that type. Then we have in the Galapagos Islands, the Headless Gringa. The islands were home to a U.S. Army post during the war. According to the legend of the Headless Gringa, a soldier lived on post with his wife. Later found out she was cheating on him and he pushed her off a cliff. If this wasn't gruesome enough, her head caught between some rocks as she fell, and the momentum of the fall caused her head to snap off of her body. There are no records of this actually happening. But ever since then, sailors and airmen have had encounters with the Headless Gringa. Most common experience is somebody climbing into their bed and pressing their weight on their chest to suffocate them. I mean, it'd be disconcerting enough to have somebody that you don't know crawl into your bed, but to crawl up on your chest, that's stretching it a bit. Well, in 1991, a young woman was in her new family home in Colmar, France. And in the attic, she found a hole in the wall through which she could see into another room, but there was no door to it. Later came back with a flashlight and shined it through the hole and saw something in the other room. A young man was sitting on the floor with his knees up to his chest. He turned his head to look at the woman and her friend and smiled. And first they thought he was a real person, later realized he didn't have any color. The grandmother later learned the house was a clandestine printing office during the war that printed slogans against the Germans. Apparently, he was a holdover from the war. Well, there are many, many stories about strange things that happened during the war. Then we've got a story called The Ghost of Normandy, the most decorated soldier in U.S. history. February 1979, there was a call from Chief Warrant Officer Carl Hansen of the Ward's office in the Pentagon. And he said, Colonel Irvin, I got news for you. Digging through our files, we've located a bona fide application for the Congressional Medal of Honor sent to us by Sergeant Earl Evans. Now, Sergeant Evans spent the last months of the war as a German POW. Captured shortly after Matt Urban's final evacuation from the front. As one pushing the U.S. administration to recognize the valor and action of his comrade. Took him almost 35 years to accomplish that administrative crusade. Now, Matt had been injured seriously in the throat, taken back to England to be hospitalized, and only focus was making it back to the front lines where he belonged with his men. He became a stowaway on an airplane heading for Paris and missed a pilot crew flying to Germany to take him with him. When he landed, he was to be finally arrested by the military police, held out to see for the last time his battalion before heading back to the States to recover from his wounds. Well, the fascinating thing is, according to reports, he's still trying to rejoin his unit. Now, you have to keep in mind that intense emotion can actually give an imprint like a memory that everybody can see. Well, the problem is that these imprints don't have an end. And they will continue to show up. The stories of the ghost of World War II show no signs of stopping. On the Normandy beaches, ghosts are seen. Skeletons are still found periodically. June 6, 1944, Angelo Paradiso crossed English Channel, 21 years old, to fight for the Allied cause with the 90th Infantry. He landed on Utah Beach. There's a great difference between reading these stories and actually having been involved in military operations. You cannot imagine the feeling in the air when your unit moves out to engage the enemy. Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show and the end of the week. We'll be back on Monday. And once again, you've been listening to Ken Hudnall, the Ken Hudnall Show. Until then, have a truly great weekend.